Right, so in this episode, we are going to fabricate a turbo manifold for Johnny's K20 powered Allegro. I'm going to go through where to mount the turbo, things to consider, and all the construction methods and techniques I'm going to use to make a high quality turbo manifold that's going to last. So we've got our turbo. This is from Owen Developments. We've already talked about this previously, or Johnny has in one of his episodes, and we know what we've got to work with. But things to consider when kind of starting out with a car that isn't turboed, or you haven't got a turbo that you're replacing, are things like how are you going to get the gas to it, how are you going to get the gas out of it, have you got room for an air filter, and all of these kinds of things. So the first thing I always like to do is kind of build up as much of the turbo as I can so that I know what constraints I'm working with. So I've got an air filter, which is just one I had on the shelf that I've used for other kind of developments in the past. And I'll put that on the front of the turbo so that I know if there was no intake pipe or anything like that, which there might be on this car, but I want to try and leave enough room for an air filter to go directly on the turbo if I can. And then the other thing I want to do is, using my ICE Engine Works blocks, is actually create the first elbow of what would be a downpipe, so that I know I've got the full constraint length of the turbo system, and I can offer that up to know that I've got enough room on the bulkhead to get a tight radius bend in without having to cut across or do loads of crazy pie cuts or something like that. Things like this are really important. So I'm going to clamp this elbow onto the turbo and then try and kind of position the turbo where I think it's likely to go, and then I'm going to look at creating a support bracket for it, which I'm going to mount off of the cam cover. So the first thing that I've got to consider now that I've got this elbow on and an air filter on the front is I've obviously got the engine mount underneath. So we need to raise it up a little bit from the engine mount, but not much, because I want to try and keep it low. It's a heavy thing, lower centre of gravity, loads of benefits to keeping it a bit lower. Getting the gas to and from it is one of them. But how I'm going to make a bracket for this is kind of like they would do like in motorsport use or like touring cars, things like that. Is I'm going to use a rose joint via a bracket off of the hot side of the turbo, so off of the turbine housing, which is bolted on. I'm going to create a bracket which bolts onto there and holds this rose joint, and then from this rose joint I'm going to go to the cam cover and take these 3 bolt points, which previously held a wiring loom bracket, I think, or a coolant pipe or something like that, something that we're not going to be using. So I'm going to use those 3 bolt points, create a bracket which kind of triangulates over to this rose joint and hangs the turbo in the position we need it. We can then tweak it and adjust it if we need, but once we've got it roughly where we think, we can begin to make the manifold. So the first thing I need to do is to make the bracket that's going to sit on the turbo, and then the bracket that's going to sit on the cam cover. So got my cardboard, I'm going to take these bolts out of the turbine housing, use one of the core clamps to actually do my hole pattern, figure out what kind of shape I want to make it, and same on the cam cover. Got this bracket on the turbo, drilled a little hole in it for the Weight Watcher people that love to call out things for being heavy. And I got the bracket onto the cam cover. It's still a bit full fat stainless at the minute. The reason I've done that bit out of stainless, and it kind of looks a bit ugly at the minute, I've still got all the edges and things to round off, is that when we put the rest of the kind of sport bracket on it, the plan is I'm going to be able to polish it all. so it looks fancy. So that's the next thing to do really, is I'm going to probably create like a bit of a 3 bars which are going to come out from this engine support bracket and match up to here. So I'm going to add a kind of bracket for this to go onto, which is going to have 3 bars going over to here as like a triangle. Think of like the Eiffel Tower on its side. That's basically what I'm going to make. So what I've got is another bit of plate and a bolt, and that's going to drop just in there like so, and that is going to become the kind of finishing point, I guess, for the bar. So now what I'm going to do is, using this bar, I'm going to go between this plate and here 3 times to kind of create like a triangle, say to a point, Eiffel Tower on its side. That's what you're imagining here. So I'm going to cut this to a rough length, try and get it in position, and then I'm basically going to have to try and tack it all in place. I've obviously got to do a little bit of repositioning of the turbo yet, because it can't live exactly where it is. I need to get it a bit tight to the engine, a little bit further away from the bulkhead, but cut some bar and I can start roughly figuring it out then. Get back. Right, so what I've done is I've actually tacked a bar onto this plate in what I think is roughly about the right position. What that's going to allow me to do now is play around with the turbo, put that in the position I think it wants to be, and then try and bend this bar to match that, and kind of hope I get lucky. If I do, I can then hopefully just weld it all from the bench. I just need to get from point A to point B with 1 bar in the middle, get that tacked together, and then I can put the other bars in and do it all on the bench without having to try and do any welding in the engine bay. So yeah, I'm now just going to like lift the turbo into position using this bracket as like a bit of a, a central point, and I just want to try, and if I can, get it so that when the turbo is in the position I want it, this bracket is kind of in the right position, if that makes sense. So I think I want to be like halfway down this bracket and then at a bit of an angle. So I think what I'll do now is I'm going to tack this about there and then try it back on the car again, and see how far away I am basically. Eiffel Tower on its side at a wonky angle. Right, so we've got this bracket bolted on now, and it is more than strong enough. I've still got to get another bolt in yet, but it is not really going anywhere, which is, obviously we don't want it super rigid, because as the manifold heats up, it'll kind of expand and move around a little bit. So we can't have the turbo super fixed, but we do want to take a bit of the weight off the manifold and kind of, you know, transfer that through a bracket. Obviously, it's just an aluminium cam cover, so we're not expecting too much strength out of these threads, but just to help us fabricate and, yeah, to bear a little bit of the weight of the turbo off the manifold. So now I can begin to think about, I want to try and get the turbo at a bit of an angle, the gangster lean, the Honda turbo lean, just so it kind of matches the engine. We can't go too mad because the oil might not drain correctly out of the turbo. There's a specific angle you can lean the turbo to. It's normally about 20 degrees, but realistically it wants to be 0. But we're going to lean it a little bit. We can begin to think about where the exhaust is going to go. Obviously I wanted to leave enough room for this tight radius bend, because we've got to get the exhaust under the manifold. So I'm going to prop the turbo at about the correct angle I want it to be at. Then I'm going to fabricate a little bit of an exhaust with the Ice Engine Works blocks, and then go ahead and start beginning to mock the manifold up on top of that. Right, so we have got a kind of rough mock-up of a downpipe placed in there now. Beauty of the Ice Engine Works blocks is I put that together in like 30 seconds and dropped it in there. It's obviously not the final piece, but it's just something that gives me a rough idea of where a downpipe might go. so that I can build the manifold on top of it. Obviously, we are quite clearance limited here. We're very close to the bulkhead. There's more space than you get on some cars, but I don't think I've ever built a manifold where you've gone, oh, I've got loads of room to fit this in here. Sam's smiling with his twin turbo Skyline. So I've put like a mock-up of a downpipe in so that I know I'll definitely have room to get something in after. Now I need to think about where I'm going to begin to construct this manifold. So I'm going to use a cast collector, one of the Hypex 347 collectors we sell. I'll go into the 347 aspect of this a little bit later. But this is obviously going to go before the turbo because this is the 4-to-1. So 4 cylinders out the turbo, hole for the external wastegate in it, and a hole for the turbo. So that's going to go somewhere about here, I think. We've obviously got to leave room for the wastegate. Again, probably going to sit somewhere here maybe, or underneath, or I'm not 100% sure yet. But we're going to need a bend into the turbo, I know that for sure. We have not got enough room to put the collector right in front of the turbo. So we're going to have to put that somewhere here, I think, and then begin to get the 4 primaries out of the cylinder head into the collector. So again, I'm going to be using my Ice Engine Works blocks to try and roughly mock something up, and then it'll be a case of cutting some bends up, getting 1 primary made, trying to get 1 primary made in this space, and then I can take the turbo, well, take the cylinder head, flange, and the collector off, and we can make the rest of it on the bench where we've got a lot more space to work. So I'm going to try and mock something up now, see what we can get, see what we need to cut up, and then, yeah, I'll go into a little bit more detail of how I'm going to actually construct this, what I'm going to use when it's all on the bench. Before I tack this bend to this collector though, what I've done is I've put a bevel on the end of the pipe. Now I'll do that on all the joints for the tubing manifold. And as we go through each part of the manifold, I'll try and explain why I'm doing what I'm doing. But this pipe is quite thick, it's nearly 3mm thick. And although you can get a fully penetrated weld without putting the bevel on, that means you've got to put more heat into the part, and more heat means you're changing the kind of the steel properties as you weld it. Again, I'll go into that in a bit more detail as we get going. But I want to make this as easy as possible with the least amount of heat, or just the right amount of heat required to get fully penetrated weld. So if I put a bevel on it, it leaves me with like a little gully to fill in with the welding rod when I start to weld it, and that just means I can then penetrate through to the inside of the tube, and I'm kind of like filling that gully in as I go, and yeah, it just makes it a hell of a lot easier to do. So I've kind of got like a bit of an angle set up on the end of the belt sander, and I can just roll the pipe round and get a kind of really consistent bevel. So I'll tack that on now, and then we'll try it back on the car. So I've roughly mocked up the first couple of primaries. Now I wanted to do the first 2 because of the way they fit. Again, they kind of have to fit under each other. So I needed to be sure that they will actually fit without touching each other, because you can end up tripping over on the first one you make, really. So yeah, I'm sure that this first primary that I've made in these Ice Engine blocks is going to be close enough. So I'm going to cut up some bits now and start tacking them together, and hopefully get the head flange attached to the cast collector, and then we can begin to build the rest of the primaries. So we have now got this primary attached to the head flange and to the collector. I will need to break this down again so that I can weld it correctly and attach it to the head flange correctly. But what this now allows us to do is it allows us to build the next 3 primaries off the car where we've got better access, where I'm not standing on top of the jig leaning over the inner wing. I can kind of create these 3, weld them up, checking it back on the car for reference when needed, and then break this first primary down again, bevel the joints correctly so that we can weld them. So yeah, now it's a case of to the bench and start planning out the rest of the primaries. Lego time. Right, so I've got all of the primaries roughly mocked up. Again, not being too conscious of it being perfect because, like I say, these high tension blocks don't perfectly match the tube that I'm using on this manifold. But we've got it roughly there. I've checked it on the car, it fits. So now it's a case of replicating all of these primaries. Right, so we've got this one primary which joins the collector to the head flange. There's kind of many ways of building a manifold, and we've started kind of doing it this way because we don't really want to go to all the effort of making a jig or a fixture to hold the turbo location, you know, to kind of like locate this end. What we did was we made a primary and tacked it in place, and then what we'll do is we'll make the next 3 primaries and then take this one back out, prep it, weld it, and put it back in again, basically. So there's pros and cons to doing it this way. I don't normally do it this way, but again, the Allegro is not really a normal kind of processing. Normally, you know, I don't do one-offs. So, you know, when you do one-offs, you can kind of cut some corners in that respect. So what I've done is I've actually taken some offcuts of this 347 stainless tube and I've ovaled it out so that it goes inside the ovaled head flange of the Honda K20 engine. I've tacked these on, and now what I'll do is I'll actually take the cylinder head flange off of this bolted heat sink, because I've made a heat sink to bolt it down to, and I'll actually weld up on the inside, and then what I'll do is I'll bolt it back down again and weld the outside. Again, the slight disadvantage is that I can't do this one, I'll have to do that after. It's not a massive issue, it just means, you know, it's an additional part of the process. So I'll weld these all up, and then that gives us stubs to work from, and I can trim these down if I need to, but what that does give us is a really solid location into the head flange. When manifolds tend to fail, the head flange is usually an area where they fail, and it's due to the kind of welding techniques used to attach the stub to the head flange. So I'll actually do a fillet weld around here, but I'll do it on both sides, and the primary is actually stuck into the head flange. So that is generally considered a slightly more reliable way of doing it. Again, there's pros and cons, but I'm going to do it this way on this particular manifold. So yeah, I'll unbolt this now, weld up the back sides of it, and then bolt it back down again whilst it's still hot, and weld up the other end. And hopefully it should remain relatively flat. Obviously we'll have to surface it again after, but yeah, it should remain flat-ish. So you can see now how they are inside the head flange. So I'm going to weld up that gap basically. And yeah, that'll give us a really nice oval to round transition then, nice and free flowing. What I'll do is I'll weld that, and then we'll be able to grind it all out after and make it really nice and smooth. got the other side of these stubs welded now. I've obviously got the Ice Engine Works out. These blocks are the same diameter and centerline radius as the 347 bends I'm using, which is really helpful. Obviously these are a little bit limited in bend angle because these are designed for creating an equal length header, and we're not really interested in equal length on a turbo manifold. What we've got is like packaging problems, so we are a little bit limited, but it's still way better than having nothing. These are basically a 28.5 degree bend, which equals 1 inch in centerline. But yeah, that's kind of irrelevant to this project really. So what I've kind of worked out is that I need like a 90, a 60 and a 30 will get me roughly down to there. That's where we're shooting. We're shooting down into this this one here. So I've got a 90. Now I'm going to need a little bit of a leg on this one. And the beauty of these 347 bends is they come with a nice long leg on. You can have them without a leg or with a leg. So that can actually cut a lot of welds out if you want. So yeah, I'm going to start with a 90 here, and I'm probably going to have to change this for one with a leg on, but that's okay. And then I'm going to go straight into a 60 that I've cut. It's just over 60. Again, I always, when I'm at this prototyping stage, I always cut the bends a bit longer than I need them, because that allows me to trim them back once I've got a rough idea of where I'm heading. And that doesn't quite get me where I need to be. But this is where you can just kind of play around. The Ice Engine Works has told you roughly what you need, and now you can just play around, you know, try and figure out exactly what it is that you need to change to get it perfect. So I'm going to do that, probably spend the next hour messing around with these primaries, or however long it takes. So yeah, I'm going to continue to mess around with these, try and keep it as accurate as I can, and work out exactly which bits I need to trim, which bits are going to be okay, and just yeah, see if I can get these 3 primaries made up. So I'll leave the camera rolling and see what we'll come up with. Right, so I've got that 90 degree bend tacked up, and that fits in there just like that. So we'll get that unwelded up as well. It'll probably just need a little bit trimming off this end to fit perfectly, and then what we'll do is we'll actually get it really well tacked onto here and tacked onto the collector end. Then it'll allow me to remove this primary, and then we're at kind of square one really, which is nice, or a little bit on from square one. So we've got this first primary welded, or both welds on it done, and I've got a couple of decent tacks on both ends, but what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to weld this one up solid. There's not really any benefit or advantage to welding this one completely to the head flange and the collector, other than it allows me to get rid of this initial primary. If I can cut this one out the way, you know, we're starting on the right. You know, we're kind of back to square one, if you know what I mean, or say a little bit advanced, because we've then just got one, and I then just need to put that stub back in here. So I'm going to get some more decent tacks on there, get it welded on. I've got it purging, so yeah, let's get it welded, and then I can cut that one off and we can see where we're at. Right, so I got that other one cut off, stub welded in, broke the primary down, changed the design of it slightly, but obviously got it all beveled up and welded, and it's now attached to the manifold. So we've now got two primaries. What I'm going to do at this point though is actually unbolt it from the heatsink, just triple check it back on the car. We did have plenty of clearance on all these, but never hurts to triple check. And then I'll get on with the next two. These two, exactly the same process. I've already kind of mocked the third one up, and that's going to go in there, something like so. You probably can't really see that, but yeah, it's going to go something like that. And then yeah, the other one will kind of wrap around. Yeah, then it's going to be a case of we've got to weld up the end. So we've got to weld up the main flange itself, this joint onto the collector, and then we've obviously got to put the wastegate on. All welded up, obviously checked on the car, plenty of clearance in everywhere. So now it really is a case of starting to work on things like the downpipe, getting the wastegate plumbed in and all those things. But yeah, I think that'll come really when the car is on the ground and I can get the car on the lift, just because of access underneath. But yeah, I hope this was fun to watch, so we'll see you in the next one.